This is the 11th night in a row that our nation's capital has been taken over by consistent horn honking and reports of residents and journalists being harassed as those protesting vaccine mandates refuse to leave.
Today, an Ottawa judge ordered a 10-day injunction against the use of air horns at protests, and the mayor of Ottawa issued a letter to the Prime Minister and the Premier asking for 1,800 additional officers to, quote, quell the insurrection that the Ottawa Police Service is not able to contain. For the latest, let's turn to CTV News parliamentary reporter Annie Bergeron-Oliver. Annie, the injunction must be a relief for so many there.
Yeah, it's true. For a lot of Ottawa residents, they're really viewing this as a win, something finally tangible that may make a significant difference. Today, there were definitely fewer horns. The noise level was very much reduced. The question now is, how long will that last, especially if, the injunction isn't able to be enforced? We know that Ottawa police are overwhelmed, that they have already said they don't have the resources necessary to sort of get better control of this situation. And so a lot of people are looking at that statement and saying, look, if police are having issues now policing, they're not going to really be able to enforce this injunction as much as necessary. So I think there is hope that at least for the next few days that the protesters will keep the volume level down, even if that's a gesture of goodwill. And for a lot of residents, this is kind of the win that they really needed right now.
Annie, we're learning tonight an emergency debate is underway in the House of Commons. This was called by NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, and we understand the Prime Minister could be speaking. This comes at a time when Ottawa is clearly overwhelmed and it needs help from the feds.
Yeah, and you know what? A lot of people were criticizing the Prime Minister because he really hasn't said anything over the last few days. And today he was in private meetings, and a lot of people thought that he needed to show leadership and be out there and provide some strong words. So, it'd be very interesting to hear exactly what the Prime Minister has to say and whether he responds at all to the demands of the City of Ottawa. We know that earlier today, Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson wrote a letter and presented it to both the Prime Minister and to Doug Ford, urging them to send more officers. He's asking for 18 officers between the provincial and federal government, so that's likely the OPP and the RCMP. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Prime Minister commits to any type of additional supports or whether it's just more words and overall thoughts about the situation.
Yeah, so the city had a special meeting today, and then on a federal level, 4 Liberal ministers held a news conference, the first time we've heard from the federal government on this, and they're asking for a meeting with all 3 levels of government. What could come out of that, Annie?
Yeah, so the City of Ottawa wants a mediator to be appointed and wants the federal government to do that. And I was talking to somebody at the federal level, a source, who said that's very highly unlikely something that the federal government would want to do. It sort of puts them in a lose-lose situation as a federal government appointing a mediator. But what was interesting as well is that press conference you talk about the 4 federal ministers, there was very little that came out of that. They condemned a lot of the hateful behavior that we had been seeing over the last week, and they said that this situation is no longer just a protest, and they called for an end to what many people have now called an occupation or a siege in Ottawa. But there again was very little in terms of actual concrete information about what the federal government was going to do to help the City of Ottawa to get this protest to end. In fact, they said that the province and the City of Ottawa and Ottawa Police have the resources needed to deal with it. So it seems like for now, the federal government is going to continue having a bit more of a hands-off approach, leaving this situation instead to the province and to the city.
You know what? While it starts out sometimes controversial, when people hear that message, when they hear how carefully we're doing it, when they hear the supports that are in place, they become, in the main, very supportive. And the same is going to be true, I think, if we do careful, gentle densification in different areas of the city, that we will be able to persuade people that this is something that is going to be in the best interest of maintaining stable neighborhoods, of making sure that we can look our own kids and others in the eye and say, yes, there is a place for you in Toronto.
Ontario's Housing Affordability Task Force has a report out today that recommends a goal of building 1.5 million homes in 10 years. The government-appointed task force says house prices in Ontario have nearly tripled in the last 10 years, far outpacing income growth and a lack of supply. That is a key issue.
The Ford government identified 5 main areas included in the report's 55 recommendations. Make changes to planning policies and zoning to allow for greater density and increase the variety of housing. Reduce and streamline urban design rules to lower costs of development. Depoliticize the approvals process to address NIMBYism and cut red tape to speed up housing. NIMBYism is not in my backyard. Prevent abuse of the appeal process and address the backlog at the Ontario Land Tribunal by prioritizing cases that increase housing. And finally, align efforts between all levels of government to incentivize more housing. To discuss this report, we welcome to CP24 Tonight Richard Lyle, President of Residential Construction Council of Ontario, and Marlene Coffey, CEO of the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association. We appreciate both of you making time to talk about this report. Richard, it seems like this report is recommending we cut through a lot of red tape on the municipal level to encourage more construction. What's your perspective?
Well, I'm still kind of pinching myself because I've been at this for 30-odd years, and the problem that the crisis we have has been decades in the making. It was like a slow-moving freight train. The problem was you had different levels of government and different actors not aligned, and you didn't have housing policies aligned with transit policies, with immigration. The growth plan, for example, was working off of old demographics, which was quite shocking, and there was a lack of data. So this thing kind of crept up on us. And then it became a problem before COVID, and then COVID just rammed it home. And so I'm delighted that we now have a very comprehensive strategy here with this task force report, and hopefully it'll get adopted, to address the broad range of issues. I mean, the number of recommendations in the report reflect the complexity of the problem that we've been dealing with.
Marlene, I want to get your thoughts. What did you make of this report, and will it help low-income families find the housing they need?
Well, thank you for the question. The report is a really important piece as we look forward to building in Ontario that is really inclusive for all communities. And so we know that not-for-profit housing is to housing what hospitals are to healthcare or what schools are to education. And so it's absolutely critical that as we look at complete communities, that we include community housing as part of that spectrum, the continuum. If we think about housing where homelessness is on one end of the continuum and housing ownership is on the other end of the continuum, we, of course, are very interested in that part in the middle, which is about rental housing and affordability, and most importantly, deep affordability for Ontarians.
And that word densification that we heard the mayor use today, Marlene, could that help when we consider rental properties, or at least, building on top of each other so we can have more space to live in the same location?
Well, there isn't any one singular solution here to addressing the housing crisis. Rather, there's a combination of policies and regulations and tools that can be offered to the development community to ensure that we're building those inclusive and complete communities. So density is one of those solutions. Transit-oriented development would be another one. And there are so many parts of the funding model to enable us, to help us become part of that equation for development of affordable housing in Ontario.
Yeah, affordability is such a huge issue here. Richard, 55 recommendations. The plan is to build 1.5 million homes in 10 years. When I hear that, I think that's rather ambitious. What do you think? Can this happen?
Hey, well, you know what I say? Go big or go home, right? It's going to be a heck of a challenge because we do have other challenges right now facing the industry, and I'm hoping that we'll get through some of them. But things like supply chain problems, we have a skilled labor shortage, and this is where we're looking at immigration changes. And of course, we've been at the training and apprenticeship reform process for some time, and the province of Ontario is really, Minister McNaughton's all over that. That's looking quite good. So, yeah, it's going to be a challenge, but, I think we can do it. I was very pleased in the report that it said that the Deputy Minister of Housing be given the authority to create an all-government committee to meet weekly as this or whatever. I mean, I'm hoping the government really goes ahead with this, but as this gets implemented, it's going to be monitored. It's not going to be another report that's going to sit on a shelf, and we can't afford that. You know, we're behind every other developed jurisdiction that counts, and our process, and this is the key thing about this report that I think has to be appreciated. It's really focused on the supply side of things and fixing the systemic barriers, which are many, to housing. And I'm looking forward to, and I see the government has said that they're going to be dealing with some core affordability issues in social housing right after this. So, because that needs to be addressed too, because we have people in our community that, through no fault of their own, can't pay for housing, and we have to obviously support those people and do something about it, and in fact do a much better job about it, because part of this crisis has been that ever-growing list of people looking for social housing and needing it, and it's critical. But for now, let's fix the systemic barriers and the problems, many of which are, like, I mean, they shouldn't have been there in the first place, but they're there, and streamline this process, and we'll get to building housing. We're going to need some innovation here. We're going to be doing modular, offsite, panelized housing, all kinds of really neat things to affect this, because we have to.
Yeah, it's a crisis, and time is of essence here. But then when you think about the red tape that's going to be cut, it's consultations, it's environmental concerns, maybe it's NIMBYism, not in my backyard, right? And when we talk about social housing, sometimes we see that reaction. Marlene, do you think that cutting red tape will help improve things for people who are looking for a place to live?
Well, we're certainly in a housing crisis, and that means a couple of things. So development and supply is part of the solution, but we also have to ensure that we're protecting the stock that we currently have. So over time, over those 30 years, there has been investment into community housing, which is part of our social infrastructure. And it's absolutely essential that we maintain those assets and are in the position where not-for-profit community housing can actually build to add to the supply. So we have created a 10-year affordable housing plan for the province of Ontario, which lines up with the National Housing Strategy on a 10-year time horizon. And what we identified there is that we need to build, and this was pre-COVID, 99,000 new units of affordable community housing to be part of that continuum so that people have choice as they move up and down the housing spectrum. Within the 99,000 units that we've identified, we know that 22,000 of those units need to be dedicated and committed to Indigenous housing and new development. And of course, we know supportive housing is also important, and we need an additional 30,000 units to make sure that the proper supports are there for families, for senior citizens, for new Canadians, and single-parent households.
Marlene, we've been talking about this housing crisis, all the red tape. Richard's been talking about systemic barriers. I want to ask you how all of this impacts young people and racialized communities.
Well, hey, that's something it's pardon me for jumping in, but, we've done a horrible disservice to young people, millennials, Gen Xers, and so on, who have, we've got incredible talent, incredible young people in the province, and needless to say, they've done everything that we want them to do, get college, get education, a skilled trade, hopefully. And then they come out and they're success stories. And guess what? They can't afford the housing. It's unsustainable. And more recently, we're seeing reports of, we're losing talent to other jurisdictions because our housing costs are too high. I saw a thing where a major bank just set up a new data center in Calgary, and one of the reasons was the housing costs in Toronto were too high. So we really need to do a better job to support them and, support their futures. If you think of all the condos we have downtown, great, serving the STEM sector and things like that. Where's the traditional housing, transitional housing, so they don't have to go way outside of Toronto to get something affordable. You know, I'm looking forward to. We've got that Portlands area, which is ideal for building family-styled apartments in that area. If we can get this right, we'll be able to do that, and they'll be able to transition, you know, not far away. Things like that. And don't forget, you know, that whole area it's the biggest redevelopment site in North America. We need to move on it, and I'm hoping that this will create the impetus to really move that forward a little bit faster and make those connections. And then when you look at our densities, I mean, one of the problems we had was we created a growth plan, and we decided not to have more urban sprawl, which is great, but then they forgot the density offset, right? There wasn't enough of that done to compensate for reducing sprawl. So now we're going to really get to that and fix that problem. So
okay.
I'm very excited about this.
Okay, we've run out of time, but Marlene, I'll give you maybe 15 seconds to answer that and talk about the people this touches.
Yeah, community housing is an important part of that continuum, and access to financing and ensuring that we maintain affordable housing stock is absolutely key to building and growing communities.
Okay, Richard Lyle and Marlene Coffey, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your insight. We certainly appreciate your time tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
What we're doing right now is actually preparing ourselves and essentially getting a footprint in place, so we have officers in place, ensuring that all our officers are briefed properly. I can't tell you a timeline as to what we expect, but it's part of what Toronto Police has done is taking the initiative to gather our resources, put a plan in place, and start actually, taking action.
So Toronto Police, they're preparing for another possible demonstration around Queen's Park and Toronto's downtown core. As social media posts suggest, another influx of truckers and protesters are heading to the city, potentially from Ottawa. This as the Ottawa occupation is approaching its second week, and blockades continue across the country, including at the Windsor-Detroit Ambassador Bridge. That is the busiest border crossing in North America.
For those watching, it seems like there's no end in sight to the truckers' campaign. We want to discuss the occupations and the logistics of this, and also some of the psychology tonight. Joining us now are CTV public safety analyst and former OPP commissioner Chris Lewis and Colin Rose, associate professor of history at Brock University. Thank you both for joining us. Chris, we'll begin with you. This threat to move to Toronto, it was posted to TikTok. How reliable is that? We don't really know, but what do police do with that kind of intelligence, and how do they authenticate that information?
The police will be monitoring all different social media platforms. They'll also have people that are telling them things from within the blockade, without a doubt. They'll be getting little tidbits of this and tidbits of that. They kind of put that all together and analyze it, and then make a decision on whether or not to deploy resources. The fact that they are tells me they believe that there's a possibility this is happening. There's been some other scuttlebutt I've heard from the Ottawa end to say we're moving to Toronto. Is that just an idle threat to confuse authorities? Who knows? But I think there's a pretty good possibility that will occur, at least in part, either new truckers or some of the ones from Ottawa. So time will tell, but Toronto Police has put a plan in place, and they'll deal with it in their way.
Colin, as Chris is noting, it's not clear if, this will materialize. You have studied and commented on what happened in the U.S. after the January 6th insurrection. I want to share what you said in an interview after January 6th last year in one report. You said, "We give up certain rights and freedoms to our governments, and in exchange, they protect us from the unpredictable, respond to our needs, and help us achieve our wants. In the midst of a global pandemic, it becomes clear that the state is unable to meet all these needs and provide these protections." Colin, it appears quite clear that this is what people are frustrated with, the government, but it also appears there's no end in sight to what's taking place here. Where do we go from here?
That's a really fascinating question, actually. I was trying to figure out exactly where we go from here this afternoon, and it's really difficult to tell. I don't know what government or police or authorities could do now that would satisfy the philosophies and ideologies that have popped up in these convoys. I made that statement last year in response to the Defense Research and Development Canada report that came out in October 2020, which was tracking how disinformation and media disinformation and social media disinformation specifically was creating and sort of boosting the three trends of distrust in government, populist support for sort of radical politics, and then the manifestation of extreme organizations. And these convoys and these bridge protests or blockades really manifest all three of those trends. And it's difficult to sort of understand what would satisfy them, because in many ways, I mean, their stated demands are
and everything.
Foods.
And the mandates, and then we're staying till we end the mandates.
And I mean, sort of. I mean, that's where it started. But then there's also, and the mandates by dissolving Parliament and such. So it's difficult to understand exactly what could happen that would send everyone home. Because if we ended all mandates tomorrow, what would happen then?
Right.
And I don't know. Right.
So something to ponder.
I'm not
for
sure
sure.
what would. Yeah, I'm not sure what the end game here is for either the authorities or the blockaders.
Yeah. So Chris, with that, I guess we'll bring you in. What is the end game here? How do we quell these protests from a policing perspective? Is there anything we can do? How does this end?
Well, and Colin's right. The end game has changed so much as to the point now they just want to overthrow government. None of that's happening. The end game is going to be that they go truck to truck. They form a perimeter around that area. They go truck to truck, and they say, move now or you're under arrest. And they're going to have to arrest people and take them away, and have to deal with the children very carefully around that as they make those arrests and get all those people out of there. And then, of course, I was talking to an OPP, former OPP expert today about this, and he says, who cares about the trucks? Get all the people out of there. And then have a perimeter around there and then deal with the trucks. They're not, we'll deal with that rather than have all those
Chris,
people.
you just brought up the kids, and I want to point out about 25% of trucks in Ottawa have kids in them. That's the latest from police on the ground. How does that impact policing tactics? And does that sort of hinder operations?
Well, it does. It adds a different layer to it. I mean, but quite often you're doing drug raids in houses where there's children, you're arresting killers in houses where there's children, and you deal with it. You have the right people there, Children's Aid and different child services organizations, and you look after those kids and make sure they're safe. That's just part of the operation. It's an extra dynamic that's not often there, but a lot of the big First Nations protests that we dealt with, we had elderly Second World War veterans in wheelchairs and kids amongst the crowd, and you just have to deal with it as best you can, and it'll go well. It's just that they need the resources there to get all those people arrested and out of there.
And Chris, from an operations and logistics perspective on behalf of police, why has some of this not happened yet? Of course, we recognize everyone's constitutional right to protest peacefully, but we're approaching in a few days the second week of this occupation, as police are calling it. Why have police not said, we're going to, frankly, you got to leave your truck or we will have to forcibly, unfortunately, remove you?
Well, in the initial build-up of this, I think the Ottawa police expected one thing and they got another. So there was a failing there, and just reality of sometimes things go well and sometimes they don't, and they didn't go well there. So they let it really take hold, take root, and now they're scrambling to get resources to try and deal with it because they didn't have the contingency in mind and they weren't prepared for it. And it's dragged on way longer than it should. By Tuesday or Wednesday last week, this should have happened.
Okay, so
it's a pathetic protest result, but so be it. Deal with those two.
Okay, so it sounds like Ottawa Police, as has been the case, a bit of unpreparedness on their part. Colin, what I wanted to ask you is something that you have studied as well. Is social and political unrest is not unusual throughout history when we look at times of let's say, natural disaster. When we talk about where this goes from here in terms of history repeating itself, how did some of those cases end?
Well, my book, my recent book, is about exactly that. Is about a sort of wave of societal violence in the wake of a massive plague in 1630, and what it leads to are both sort of short-term and long-term effects. And what Chris is talking about, sort of, if we move in and arrest all the trucker convoys, that's a very short-term solution. That's not going to solve the root problem, which is that this growth in distrust of democratic governments, which is seen both here in Canada as well as in Europe, as well as in the United States, has really strong potential to undermine a lot of what we've worked for in our democratic countries over the last 60, 75 years in the post-World War II order. Historically, these movements manifest in different ways. They often manifest in ethnic or ethno-religious violence. For instance, in the 19th century, after the explosion of Krakatoa in Indonesia, it's a volcano, there's a large wave of sort of anti-Western violence, anti-sort of Dutch East India Company violence led by the populations of Indonesia. In medieval Europe, and this is, obviously medieval Europe is a big place, but in the wake of the sort of 14th and 15th century plagues, we see these flagellant movements, sort of religious revivalist movements.
So Colin, if I can jump in, I apologize, but what you're saying is throughout history, what we've seen is even if the truckers leave the trucks, the idea of mistrust in the government is not going to end. I'm sorry, Colin.
I mean, if the truckers are dragged away from the trucks, it only gets worse.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
And one last question for you, Chris, very quickly. I want to look ahead to this potential protest in downtown Toronto. What mistakes, according to you, have Ottawa police made, and what can Toronto police learn from those mistakes?
Well, Toronto can learn from any mistakes Ottawa did or things that worked in Ottawa. Conversely, the good and the bad. So they're blocking a specific area based on their intelligence. They're making firm statements. They're going to allow trucks to a certain point and not others, but they still want it to be peaceful and will allow that as they normally do. I think they'll be very well prepared and have contingencies in place behind the scenes that we won't know about unless they're required. That'll help to deal with anything that pops up that shouldn't be there, like Ottawa actually ended up dealing with ultimately.
Right. Who knows where this could go? Toronto police have to be prepared regardless. Chris Lewis and Professor Colin Rose, thank you so much for your expertise tonight. We certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've had to pull together as a community. We've met as a staff. We've met as a school community, spoken to the school, the students, and it's going to be difficult, but we're going to pull through. We're a strong community. We pride ourselves on inclusivity, and we're really going to have to rely on that and to work forward. And most importantly right now, we're going to have to take care of those who've been specifically, who've been harmed.
A high school in Etobicoke is investigating after anti-black graffiti was discovered in 3 of the school's washrooms. The school's principal says students discovered all of the graffiti and that those responsible will be held accountable. It's an incident that not only harms the black community and the greater community, but it's an act of hate carried out during Black History Month and during a time when the Toronto District School Board is celebrating African Heritage Month.
And this comes as other TDSB schools have unfortunately made headlines this week for derogatory and racist incidents. Here to talk about this are Nigel Barif, an elementary school teacher with the Toronto District School Board and an executive officer with Elementary Teachers of Toronto. Also, Nigel, you're the board chair of the Urban Alliance of Race Relations. Thank you for being here. Xavier McLaughlin is the student and family advocate with the group Parents of Black Children. And Maya Thomas is a grade 10 student at Etobicoke School of the Arts. This is where these incidents took place. Thank you all for joining us. Maya, I want to start with you, and I want to thank you for reaching out to us here at CP24 to share your thoughts. I can't imagine how incredibly painful this is for you and your peers, but why don't you share with us how you felt when you heard about these incidents?
At first, I was upset and I was angry, but I didn't think too much of it. And then I went home and I thought about it some more, and I thought about how someone at my own school could feel safe enough to write that in our bathroom stalls. And I got insanely hysterical and I couldn't stop crying, and I was just extremely frustrated with what I thought was a strong community at my school.
And is that frustration too, knowing that this was written likely, potentially, by one of your peers, people who you maybe partake in activities with? This is an art school. You might be in a play with them. You have lunch with them. These are people that could be in your wider group of friends.
I think that was probably the hardest part for me, for realizing I could be in any class at any time of the day, and it could have been the person I was sitting next to, and I won't have known. And that, I think, was the part that probably messed with me the most. and thinking that they could be my friend and still be saying this.
Maya, I know you posted about this as well on social media. Why did you feel that was so important to do?
I felt that a lot of people weren't talking about it, and I knew that I do have a little bit of a following on my Instagram account, and a lot of people from school follow it. And I decided that I wanted to say something about it because I knew that if this wasn't going to be spread around by students, then this would not have taken off and people wouldn't have made it such a thing now that's now being aired on TV.
Maya, do you think your peers as a whole recognize the harm a word like this causes, or do people sometimes think this is a joke or something?
I think some people do understand the weight of really what they're saying, but I think some people think that it's just some joke and that it's not damaging and not implementing on like how I'm going to feel later in life. But I think that they need to start understanding and being taught that this is going to weigh us down now and later in the future.
Thank you so much, Maya. I want to bring in Xavier McLaughlin, who's the student and family advocate for parents of Black children. And Xavier, this organization, Parents of Black Children, was created so that parents can help navigate and well, they can get assistance navigating the school system and support their children. And when you and others as part of your organization see this, I mean, this is the work you've been spending the last few years to combat.
And so when we see this, although it may seem or come as a surprise to many, I can say that since September, the start of the school year, we have experienced 116 cases that include incidences of anti-Black racism.
Xavier, the principal at Maya's school has promised that there will be accountability. I can tell you, we've reached out to Toronto Police twice today on this issue and have not heard back on this incident. Are you confident that there will be accountability?
I cannot speak for myself. I speak for our organization, but I think we've learned as an organization that accountability comes when those who are in positions of power are held to account. And oftentimes, if we look to school boards to investigate incidences that happen within school boards, we don't get the best results. So we often recommend that there is a third party that's involved. But
Nigel, I wanted to
underreporting.
Sorry to interrupt there. Nigel, I wanted to ask you, do you feel that some of what we're seeing in Ottawa is normalizing this racism?
That's exactly, what we've seen the connections. We saw the swastikas, we saw the Confederate flags that were being waved around and normalized as part of this freedom convoy. And it is so hurtful. Maya, I am so proud of you lifting your voice, representing the students in our schools. I'm really hoping that both you and all of the students around you will rise up and say to the school board, say to the community, that we will not tolerate the continuing anti-Black racism that we see in the school system. And to answer your question directly, yes, I believe that when you see the lack of accountability from our government to hold these types of people demonstrating in the streets in that way, spreading hate. Definitely, it seems that that fascists, that white supremacists are comfortable doing these things to our children and doing these things within our current communities.
Nigel, so we're really grateful to have you here because of your many roles in terms of, one, you're an educator with the TDSB, and then you're also the head of the Urban Alliance for Race Relations. So you were an employee of this board, but you're also someone that works to eliminate this anti-Black racism. Do you feel that what you're seeing amongst the board is a heightened level of accountability in, let's say, even the last few months? As Xavier noted, there have been dozens and dozens of instances of anti-Black racism or other instances of hate, even if we don't hear them in the news.
I encourage folks to continue to follow Parents of Black Children. Xavier's group has been doing an outstanding job tracking this information and getting the community be able to report these. They're basically doing the job that the board and the Ministry of Education should be doing to protect our children in the school system. The Urban Alliance for almost 50 years, we've been fighting racism in the public education system, in the police system, in the courts. It just feels like it's never stopping. And we, what accountability looks like is finally having a full inquiry into these incidences. We have cases after cases that are happening, and we're never having anybody that's being held accountable. We don't see the police laying charges. We don't see the courts making sure that we put people that are put behind bars when they do these hate crimes. They're not taking it serious enough. This is abhorrent. It has to stop.
Maya, I wanted to ask you, what role do you feel students play in taking a stand against this type of hate?
I think a lot of it is very performative. I think people can just post a story and think I did my part. I was anti-racist for that. But I think that it's part of a much bigger thing. And I think we all need to come together as a community and as a school, every school, and we really need to actively fight against this. And I think that if you see racism or microaggressions in your classroom or in your friends, even if it's a small thing, you need to check them, because small things don't stay small. They turn into bigger things. And that's how this hate crime started, by people ignoring the small thing.
Xavier, I wanted to ask you a similar question to Nigel. Do you feel that the rhetoric, or at least some of the rhetoric that's coming out of the protests in Ottawa, is it making people feel more emboldened?
I think that's no doubt. I think when you see things normalized in public, it then makes some of those things percolate even more in society. So I'd have no problem saying that what you're saying is true. But as parents of Black children, we deal with these issues all the time. And so our goal is to really help students and families navigate through these kind of issues and instances as well, too.
Maya, if we can end with you here, and thank you so much, Nigel and Xavier. What's your message to those behind this, whether they thought this was okay to write, whether they thought it was a prank, whether they intended harm? If you could reiterate to people, you said you were hysterical, how it makes you and other students of color feel to know that that word was written in the bathroom of your school. Like you said, school should be a safe place where you go and have a great time with your peers. What would your message be?
I hope you know that even you're probably watching this right now because you heard that it was going to be on the news. I went home and I cried for hours, and my mom asked me what's wrong, and I said, I don't even want to go to school anymore. I feel uncomfortable walking in my halls. I feel alienated. There's barely any Black students at my school, and now we all feel so alone and so separated from everyone. So I hope you realize the damage of what you've done, and I hope that you face the repercussions coming to you.
Maya, you are not alone, but I recognize that you do feel that way right now. And I thank people like Xavier and Nigel for coming on, who no doubt support the community and some of the challenges that you and your peers face. So thank you all for coming on to talk about this. And Maya, thank you so much for really having the courage to speak out as a young woman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.